The death of Princess Diana in 1997 shocked the world, leading to an unprecedented outpouring of emotion. At her funeral, we watched on with grief as her young sons walked behind their mother's coffin in a moment that many of us will never forget. Mark, you were Nine's Europe correspondent at the time in London. Let's take a look at one of your reports the days after the tragedy.
For the thousands who lined the route, saying goodbye was a deeply personal affair. Diana was not only a princess, but above all, a real person who was so many things to so many different people.
Mark, besides the dark hair, I know we have to mention the hair, but tell me, how did you first hear the news?
Well, it's a strange story. I was actually driving through Paris the night she died, and I was with a cameraman. We'd been working in France, and we didn't know whether to stay in Paris or not. We ended up deciding to go to London, go back to London, which we did. We got in there late that evening, and we were exhausted. I went to bed. I got a phone call at about 2 o'clock from somebody in our office saying, "You need to get to a TV. Diana, I think Diana's dead." Now, I could hear a lot of cheering and raucous behaviour behind, and I thought she was drunk. I just didn't believe it. I put the phone down. And I went back to sleep. She called me 10 minutes later and said, "You really need to get up and look at the TV." So I did. I went downstairs and my jaw just dropped. I couldn't believe it because they started showing shots of the Mercedes, the tunnel. And so I was actually getting dressed in the dark. I said to my wife, "I don't think you're going to see me for a while."
Yeah.
I got in the car and I drove to work. And we just worked non-stop for about 2-3 weeks before we had a break.
Unbelievable. Well, the response from the public was just such an outpouring of grief. Just talk us through those scenes outside Kensington Palace.
When so the news broke during that early morning, so most people in London weren't aware of it. So we went out on the streets. This was very, very early in the morning, about 6 o'clock, and I was doing what we call vox pops, interviewing people, trying to get their reaction. I had one guy at a train station who wanted to knock my head off because he thought I was joking. And I said, "No, it's just happened." He said, "That's rubbish."
It's not true.
He became very angry. We went to Kensington Palace, and I got the first woman walking up to the gates and putting a flower on the gates that she had heard. And from that one flower grew into a sea of flowers, 200 metres wide. It was incredible. And then the news that we then broadcast, it hit here at about 9 o'clock in the morning in London time, 6 o'clock here. More Australians knew about what was going on than most Brits.
Because of the time zone difference?
Because of the time zone. People were just waking up in the UK to hear the news and then absorb the shock. So Australians actually were getting the scoop on what was going on before the Brits.
Juliet, you were there as well. What was it like?
Oh, it was extraordinary. I was working just over the road from Kensington Palace, and every day the crowds were coming and coming and coming. I remember you couldn't buy any flowers anymore. Every newsagent was actually cashing in, I have to say, and stocking with more and more flowers, and you couldn't buy them. And so much crying, so much outpouring of grief. It's like nothing I had ever seen. You know, Diana's sons at the time, they were still in Balmoral, of course, and there was a lot made out of that, which I think now when we look back was a bit unfair. The Queen, you know, they were there with the Queen and Prince Charles, and then Prince Charles flew to Paris to bring Diana's body back. Meanwhile, the Queen was looking after the boys. She didn't want to expose them to the public. You know, the grief was deeply setting in for them, and that was seen as a bad thing at the time. We all know about that, but I think looking back, I think that was a bit of a bad call by the public. You know, those boys should have stayed in Balmoral and should have been protected.
Deb, do you agree with what Juliet's saying? Because the Queen did cop a lot of flack for not...
I think it was a defining moment for the royal family, and the difference between how one used to behave and moving forward. And I think that there was a misjudgment there by the Queen, not really understanding what was going on, because we've seen in The Crown and various others, she is so much about protocol, and the protocol they'd never had an experience like this. So she gets torn between the protocol of being the Queen and a human being. So I think it was just a misjudgment, and it took a while, and you know, if we're to believe what we hear, it was Tony Blair who rang and said, "Mum, you're really not responding to this in the right way." But you know, you have to give her some slack in that they had never been through this before. But I think that the media were really sort of setting the agenda here, and they were not responding to what really she should have done probably a day earlier.
I think the public also, you know, the media were interviewing members of the public, and members of the public were angry.
Yes.
They blamed the royal family. They saw that they thought that the royal family wasn't supporting Diana enough and Diana's boys enough, and I think I find all of that quite hard to watch now. Now we know how William and Harry were thinking. Now they've talked about it more.
The headline in one of the British papers about 2 to 3 days later, I never forgot it, said, "Show us you care, Mum." And that drove that infamous interview, or the announcement from the Queen, which was hastily rigged together, lit badly. She didn't look on top of things. She was in Buckingham Palace, shot down the mouth, where she said, you know, as a mother, grandmother, I can understand what's happening.
Let's actually have a look at that speech right now.
So what I say to you now, as your Queen and as a grandmother, I say from my heart. First, I want to pay tribute to Diana myself. She was an exceptional and gifted human being. In good times and bad, she never lost her capacity to smile and laugh, nor to inspire others with her warmth and kindness. I admired and respected her for her energy and commitment to others, and especially for her devotion to her 2 boys.
It might have taken some time, but I think that was a very personal speech and quite out of character for the Queen, wasn't it?
Yeah, it actually gives me goosebumps watching that now. I think the Queen was talking as the mother of the country there. She was talking to the people. It was the people who wanted to know that this family cared about Diana and that Diana mattered. And the Queen was expressing that in a very personal way.
It was a critical interview, Juliet. It was
very critical.
It was so critical. Had she waited another couple of days, she would have lost the British public. That was a really seminal moment for the Windsors and for the Queen.
Yeah, I totally agree. And had she not made that move, who knows what would have happened, because the public were very angry at the time.
Well, another really important moment was when the 2 boys, aged 15 and 12, were walking behind Diana's coffin. And I've got to say, it was the most heartbreaking moment. Every time I see it, I feel so much compassion and empathy for them. What do you think, and what was it like when they passed you, when you were reporting on it, Mark?
So we had a rough idea what was going to happen for the funeral. We had a rough idea it was going to go to Kensington, and then we had a rough idea of the route. We didn't know too much of the specifics. And so I had an office quite close to where the route was, so I was watching it on TV, and I had a time when I thought they was going to be reasonably close, and I ran out and so did a bit of work before the camera, and then was able to get that view of the boys walking behind the coffin. Then I went back and I reviewed it a few times. It was Philip's idea. Philip said he would come and support them and walk beside them.
Because there were rumours that it was Charles, because he was worried that Charles would be booed. That's not true?
I believe that's not the case.
Okay.
So we believe it's... And Philip, I don't get it. I really thought those boys, putting those boys through it, they looked like they wanted to be somewhere else. It was so hard for them. And that imagery is now around for the rest of time. I thought it was too much.
Sorry?
It's interesting because we're going to just have a look at what Harry has said recently about that walk and how hard it was. Let's take a listen.
The thing I remember the most was the sound of the horses' hooves going along the pavement, along the Mall, the red brick road. By this point, both of us were in shock. It was like I was outside of my body and just walking along, doing what was expected of me. Showing 1/10 of the emotion that everybody else was showing.
Charles.
So this is my mum. You never even met her.
Oh, Deb, there's been so much debate about whether or not the boys should have been made to do that walk. What do you think?
I look at that. I actually thought that it may have been you know, it's hard to say because he's going to look back on it. At the time, it was a big deal. For the royal family, it was probably the best move that they'd ever made because it did show all of the men in Diana's life standing behind her. I think that people loved it. For the boys, I would have thought actually that they would look back and probably think, we're glad we did that, even though it was very, very difficult. That bunch of flowers on the coffin with Mummy on it. It's hard to say because it was probably a very difficult thing for them to do, but imagine them sitting somewhere at home watching it on the television and potentially wishing that they were there and made that gesture. I thought it was the most beautiful gesture that two young men could make for their mother who had died in such tragic circumstances under, you know, under I'm going to say the cloud of the royal family. I think it was a great move by them.
And William has said that he was glad he did it, even though it was very hard. Yeah.
Well, during the service, Diana's brother, Earl Spencer, gave the eulogy where he pointed the finger of blame at the media. Let's take a look.
It is a point to remember that of all the ironies about Diana, perhaps the greatest was this. A girl given the name of the ancient goddess of hunting was, in the end, the most hunted person of the modern age.
Mark, do you think that helped with the backlash against the media?
Oh, it certainly did. I mean, it was an amazing speech. I remember we thought we were unsure how the funeral was going to go. When we heard that speech, we couldn't believe it. And the Queen was actually, it was also pointed towards the Queen, and she was there. It was an amazing speech. But you know, as I said before, as events transpired, there was less emphasis on the media's role in her death when it became clear that the driver was also drug and drink affected, that Diana wasn't wearing a seatbelt, and all those things came to play. But there was a huge media backlash. George Clooney, about three days after, held a press conference bagging the media.
But I think there was more than just the media and the media chasing her through the tunnel. There were photos that appeared very shortly before she died of her and Dodie on the boat. She was being hounded. People were fascinated by who is this guy, the son of the man who owns Harrods, and all sorts of things. So she had been really hounded prior to that. Now, whether that had rattled her, whether that had put them in a position where they were going to take a chance because they just couldn't take any more, I think Earl Spencer was referring to that. But in light of the recent inquiry into the BBC, I find it extraordinary that I believe it was Earl Spencer who did the negotiations for Diana to do that interview, is what I have read. So, you know,
It's
everybody, in a way,
murky.
it's all a bit murky. And in many ways, so many people were complicit, sometimes without realising it.
But I think Earl Spencer has now, you know, that whole inquiry was at Earl Spencer's request, because he took contemporaneous notes when Martin Bashir persuaded him to introduce his sister to him, and Martin Bashir lied.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
Spencer was deceived by Martin Bashir as well.
Exactly, and I find it interesting that Earl Spencer, even today, is still trying to defend his sister's reputation.
So Diana's legacy lives through her sons, who are honouring their mother by her memory by unveiling a statue of her at Kensington Palace this year. So Deb, Princes William and Harry, they really are their mother's son.
They are. They seem to be wonderful young men. And I'm interested because there was always a rumour that Prince William, when Diana lost her Royal Highness title, and that William said, "Mummy, I'll give it back to you when I'm king." Now, he's not king, but whether or not anything happens around the statue. But I think that she would be very proud of both of her boys, but I think there would be some concern about around Harry, because he is very much like his mother, but the most vulnerable part of his mother, whereas William seems to be a good balance of the two.
Juliet, do you agree?
I do. I think we can see a lot of Diana's charisma in her boys. They're both very good with the public. William wasn't way back, you know, he didn't like that public role, but he's grown into it. And in the last couple of years, he's really gained that kingly stature, hasn't he? And I think we can see little bits of Diana in everything that they do all the time. And I suspect we'll always be looking for it.
I'm always amazed just how how well adjusted they are, given what they've been through. I mean, yes, Harry's explained that he's got mental health issues, but he's open about it and he's willing to talk about it.
And we want men to talk about mental health, so he is helping. I just think, you know, it's 60 years on and yet we are still talking about it. So that's the kind of impact that Diana has had. Thank you so much, Mark, Juliet and Deb. If you want more royal stories, please go to 9honey.com.au.